Hello, my name is Joanne Shoveler. I'm the Vice President of Advancement at the University of Waterloo, and I'm delighted to have you join us this afternoon for this very exciting and very impactful session. I acknowledge today that we live and work on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. The University of Waterloo is situated on the Haldeman Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. Land acknowledgements are an honest and historically accurate way to recognize the traditional First Nations, the Métis and/or Inuit territories of a place. It is important to honor the past as a small stepping stone forward in reconciliation. If you'd like to learn more about what steps the University of Waterloo is taking towards the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, please visit University of Waterloo's Human Rights, Equity, and Inclusion Indigenous Initiatives. I want to welcome all of you, our virtual audience, to the third of a 4-part series that will focus on the human being at the center of today's most pressing issues. Thank you so much for participating and joining us virtually today. It indeed has been a unique and extraordinary moment in time. For over 1 year, we've been in the pandemic, and over the course of this year, it has never been more clear that building a greater sense of community is important for all of us to feel connected and to thrive in these challenging times. As we see the vaccines roll out, I hope that many of you join me in feeling hopeful about the months to come. We have good things ahead of us, and we have been incredibly resilient throughout this year. You, our alumni, are vital to our community, and we thank all of you for joining us today and being engaged with us throughout this year as we try new ways of engaging with you and helping each other. We are very privileged today to have our President and Vice Chancellor with us, Feridun Hamdulapur. We will get to hear from Feridun at the end of the event when he provides his final word and summarizes today's discussions. While we would love to see your faces in person, we hope today's panel discussion will be memorable and enjoyable for you. You'll receive an opportunity to share your feedback with us by way of a survey shortly after the event ends. Please do share your insights, your thoughts, and your ideas so that we can continue to adapt and find the best ways to build out our Waterloo alumni community this year and for years to come. So for your housekeeping notes, please submit your questions. You will see the chat widget on your screen and submit the questions to our panelists there. On the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see the Expo widget. We have our experts from Co-op standing by to answer any questions you may have about Waterloo's renowned cooperative education program. And I'll tell you, this year, those people are doing amazing things to make sure that we're really engaging with our community and with our students. And good news, our panelists will be staying well past 2 p.m. to respond to as many of the submitted questions as possible. So do please follow the instructions to join those additional sessions. So now, from the Faculty of Arts, our partner in this Humans End series, I'd like to introduce you to Robert Park, Acting Dean of Arts. Robert is an archaeological anthropologist with an interest in the cultures of the far north. And when not acting dean, he is a professor and associate dean of cooperative education and planning. Robert?
Thank you, Joanne. On behalf of Dean Ager and the Faculty of Arts, I'm happy to welcome you all to this third of the 4-part Humans And series, where we've had the opportunity to focus on the human both at and as the center of today's most pressing issues. Since last November, we've had the opportunity to discuss humans in health, humans in work, and in May, we'll have a talk about humans in 5G and other technological advances. Today, we've come together about humans and climate, and it may be no surprise that humans are at the center of the problem. Growing recognition of a global climate emergency means that Canadians must join all global citizens in society-wide transformations. Yet we humans resist change. Our ways of life as individuals, businesses, and governments are deeply entrenched and therefore extremely difficult to shift. In arts, research and teaching in the humanities, the social sciences, and the creative arts plays a critical role in identifying the myriad of human issues connected to climate. And I know that you, our alumni, along with our colleagues across campus, are also eager to see what we can do to help solve the cause. So thank you in advance to our moderator and panelists speaking today, and to all of you joining us in this important discussion. Back to you, Joanne.
Thank you very much, Robert. I appreciate it. This past year has opened our eyes in so many ways. Over the past year, well, much of our collective focus has been on addressing the immediate impacts of the pandemic. Climate change continues to be one of the world's greatest threats in our generation. Climate change affects all of our lives as the government invests billions of dollars into their climate change plan. Is there anything that each of us can do on an individual level to make an impact? To moderate this panel, I am honored to introduce Imre Zeman. Imre is a Canadian International Fellow, the University Research Chair, and Professor of Communication Arts. His research has propelled a new discipline, energy humanities, which grapples with the cultural transformations required for a global shift to sustainable and renewable forms of energy. Professor Zeman has gained many accolades over the years, but was most recently elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada in 2020 as one of Canada's most distinguished scholarly honors. Congratulations, Professor Zeman. I will now turn it over to you and look forward to a wonderful panel.
Thanks so much, Joanne, and thanks everybody for joining myself and our three panelists today. I'm going to introduce the panelists first, and then I'd like to pose them a question to initiate the discussion here this afternoon. We will then follow that with your own questions to the panelists, and then we'll follow that up with the discussion after this session. We're joined by three esteemed panelists today. The first is Erin Stewart, who is the Managing Director of Programs at Indigenous Clean Energy. She developed and leads its Keystone Initiative, which is the 2020 Catalyst Program, Canada's first and highly successful Indigenous clean energy capacity building program. Our second panelist is Laura Zizo. Laura is co-founder and CEO of Manifest Climate, a climate change intelligence platform for business. She's a trained lawyer focusing on climate-related risk and opportunity, and completed her undergraduate degree at the University of Waterloo in the Faculty of Environment. And finally, we're joined by Jatin Natwani, who is a professor in the Faculty of Engineering and founder of Affordable Energy for Humanity, a global change initiative. When I talked to my panelists earlier this month, after talking with them, we came up with a question that we'd like to discuss today, and it's this. Recent events have highlighted how energy systems need to be made more resilient and decentralized, foregrounding access to and availability of energy to all communities which depend on it. So here's the question, which I'd like our panelists to talk about. How has your work tried to make our energy systems work better for natural and human worlds alike? I turn it over to our first panelist, Erin Stewart.
Great, thank you very much. Good afternoon and good morning for some of our friends on the West Coast. My name's Erin Stewart. So to address this question, I just wanted to note that when we think about climate change, there's significant inequalities and inequities. And when we think about Indigenous people and the relationships to the land, we're looking at 14,000 years pre-contact. And what we see is a beautiful, vast Canada with little to no human impact. So when we talk about the fact that in 2021, climate change performance for the world showed that Canada was, doing very poorly, this proves to me that the colonial systems that we have that have been proposed in here have had grave impact on Indigenous communities and their ways of living. And so the topic today of human and climate, when we talk about humans, the humans here, Indigenous people, they didn't have a climate problem until Europeans arrived 350 years ago. And so, you know, in terms of our work, I'm the co-founder of an organization called Indigenous Clean Energy, and we're an Indigenous governed, Indigenous led not-for-profit. And so in terms of creating a more resilient and decentralized energy system, we're actually really doing this day in and day out with communities. We have worked directly with over 100 Indigenous communities, supporting their clean energy initiatives and projects on the ground. Just as an example, we're working with 15 communities from across the polar Arctic through a project called the Indigenous Off Diesel Initiative. And so we're working with those communities over a 3-year period to help them develop their community energy plans, to work on microgrids, and actually, you know, develop projects to reduce GHG emissions. And so our work is very tangible work. And, you know, when we look at the climate sphere, I kind of see it as such, where there's very important people, the people that sit at, you know, COP, that have kind of high negotiations, heads of business. But I really work with and I'm concerned about the VIPs, the very impactful people. The Indigenous people who are leading the way on climate mitigation and adaptation on the ground. And that is really what we try to do, is work with community champions for their clean energy endeavors. So I won't go into all of the programming that we offer, but I just want to say, you know, this is a topic that we don't hear a lot about. Indigenous communities are actually the largest single asset owner of renewable energy assets outside of government and utilities. They far surpass that of municipalities, and we don't talk about this enough. And so we host free monthly webinars that anybody's able to attend to learn more about this topic. You can go to icenet.work to find out about that. But as an example, we just hosted a webinar on Tuesday on the Oneida Energy Storage Project. And that project is a partnership between the Six Nations of the Grand River, so in the territory that Waterloo resides, and Enerstore. And this project is a 250 megawatt, 1,000 megawatt battery energy storage facility. It's the largest in Canada, going to be one of the largest operational facilities in the world. And it equals about 760 million in net savings to ratepayers and 4.1 million tons reduction in GHG emission. And this also equates to about 900,000 hours of local labor, Indigenous labor, local Ontario labor. And so, you know, we're looking at this from an environmental and climate perspective, but more so as well as an economic perspective, a social and an independent and resiliency perspective, and what that means for communities. And so that's my 5 minutes, I'm sure, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Erin. We'll turn it over now to Laura to describe her relation with both natural and human worlds.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all. And Erin, thanks for the great work you're doing. I think it's so important to highlight the role and the potential for learning from Indigenous communities and the natural ways that the traditional knowledge about decentralization and sharing of the great resources that we have available in this country. So appreciate that. Today is a really big day for climate change in Canada. The lawyer in me cannot help but make sure everyone on this knows that the Supreme Court of Canada has just given us a decision to uphold the constitutionality of the carbon pricing system. So how do I work on this? I am a lawyer by training. I went to Waterloo, and my ecology professor, Steve Murphy, actually said to me, "Have you thought about law school?" I wanted to do graduate work in ecology, and he said, "Ecology, I'll be here for you. I think you should go to law school." So I went to law school, went to Bay Street, and realized there's a big policy problem here. We need to get policy aligned with the reality of the climate crisis. So I spent a lot of time working on that. And then in the last few years, I realized, you know what, it's capital markets. And as much as maybe the capital market system is not fit for purpose for the world we want, it's what we've got. So how are we going to align capital markets with the climate crisis? I believe through more transparency, through greater alignment with decision-making and the reality of the climate crisis. There's a few big problems with our system that we need to kind of shine a light on that hopefully my work helps with, which is the time frame that we look at decision making. It's not concurrent with the longer time frame of climate. So we work a lot with financial institutions. They're thinking about quarterly returns. They're thinking about yearly annual reports. They're thinking about maybe 3 years out. Even long-term asset owners are thinking short-term from an investment cycle. How do we realign like what we actually want, which is long-term economic wealth, to the realities of the climate crisis? So our work at Manifest Climate is about transparency in capital markets, helping people understand how to identify, manage, and disclose climate change, the climate change related risks from a financial perspective. And it's aligned with the framework that's now becoming the gold standard for talking about this, which is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. We have a Canadian to thank in part for that, Mark Carney. When he was the governor of the Bank of England, he started this task force, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which now has 11 recommendations that are being taken up by governments all over the world about how to think about climate change from a governance strategy and risk management perspective. So it's really interesting to bring these viewpoints together and hopefully get better decision-making for businesses in the capital markets.
Thanks very much, Laura. Turn it over to you now, Jatine.
Thanks, Imre. If I may put myself in the shoes of a historian at the end of this century and looking back at the arc of historical movements, it's possible for me to conclude that the worst predictions of a climate catastrophe and total global system collapse did not come to pass. Sure enough, there were ominous and disturbing events with impacts at local and regional levels, but a complete collapse did not happen. And one may ask, what were the crucial turning points that proved effective in restoring the health of the Earth's ecosystem? Well, since the 1980s, the alarm bells have been ringing on the threat of runaway climate-driven disruptions and dislocations. And it has taken some 3 decades of high-quality scientific assessments, policy push, and let's call it political gymnastics, before one conclusion stood out with a flashing red lights and a message that read, serious destabilization of the Earth's functioning machinery was clearly evident, an existential threat was imminent, and action was necessary. The Paris Accord of 2015 was born. Of course, with twists and turns along the way and many decisions that proved to be costly and futile and others less so, somehow human ingenuity and capacity for innovation proved to be effective enough for a semblance of some stability to emerge. Mitigation and adaptation strategies allowed societies to thrive, neither equitably nor universally, but over time, the overall health of the ecosystem was restored. Mitigation of climate risk only turned out to be a partial success, in my view, somewhat of a bittersweet story, as it were. And you may say, well, how so and why? Because extreme global poverty at the end of the 21st century remains a persistent curse, as it has at the end of the 20th century. Although the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century delivered unprecedented levels of wealth to a large proportion of the global population, it failed to deliver a basic level of affordable energy access to about a third of humanity. Today, 1 billion people have no access to electricity at all, or energy services, or of a sufficient quality and quantity to sustain a livelihood. Lack of energy access is the Hobbesian trap that perpetuates a vicious cycle of poverty and a quality of life that can only be described as nasty, brutish, and short. So here's the conundrum. Fossil fuels, of course, delivered massive wealth, but with a sting and a serious legacy of harm to the environment. So now, as you embark on developing clean energy solutions to our collective futures, it would be an unforgivable tragedy of outcomes if we still find a third of humanity at the end of this century in the same state as it is today. So in my view, we have both a moral and an ethical obligation to future generations that we restore the health of the environment, but at the same time, ensure a quality of life for every global citizen that is not an insult to our sense of fairness. So here at Waterloo, I've taken a number of steps to address this challenge. One is the Global Change Initiative, Affordable Energy for Humanity, that we have brought together researchers, practitioners from around the world to advance research and develop practical solutions for ground level implementation. Thank you.
Thanks very much for all three of your comments and the information that you've provided us about the initiatives that you're involved in. I could talk on and on with all three of you individually and collectively about your projects. There's so much more I want to learn about. I invite those of us who have joined us to put forward their questions, but if I could be allowed, there is a couple of things I wouldn't mind hearing some feedback about. It's March 25th. This year's Earth Overshoot Day for Canada was March 14th. Earth Overshoot Day is a metric that is used to indicate when the Earth, as in general, but the inhabitants of the Earth, but also it breaks down to specific countries. They have used up resources exceeding the capacity that is kind of allowable to them to live in a sustainable way. Canada faces very specific challenges in addressing its energy, its climate requirements, especially in relation to energy. Aaron had pointed to a recent report by Climate Change Progress Indicator that said that Canada was 59th out of 63 countries examined in terms of its record on climate. There's very, very big challenges that we face collectively, and I would not do you the disservice of saying this open-ended question, what is it that we can do about it? But I would want to kind of follow up on all three of your points, which are really concerning energy justice. How do we make sure that we give that people can use more energy? Some people, those who have not had enough energy, this is as much of a crisis as the necessity to use less or different kinds of energy. What are the kinds of ways that we can enable that? We can enable some people to use more while also modifying or mitigating the use of energy by others. Can you just give us some sense of the challenges you feel are involved, both your own views and also in relation to the projects that you undertake?
Who would like to start? I can definitely start on this one. Yeah, so I mean, in terms of our work, is we hear it every single day. Indigenous communities want to work in this space in terms of energy transition, energy resilience, energy independence, and decentralized energy options. Where they face major barriers is actually not on a technological perspective, or even, I really liked Laura's point about different opportunities in terms of capital markets. That's actually not one of the biggest issues with these projects. The biggest project that we face often is policy. Policy that is surrounded around usually large crown utilities, government bodies that are not necessarily willing to let go of that control to allow that leadership, and for good reason. I mean, if we look at them, their main directions and directives is to make sure you have reliable power that's affordable. So where does leadership of nations and nation-to-nation relationships happen on this topic as it relates to Canada and Canada's North? And I think that that's one of the pieces that's not being considered, is the fact that Indigenous people, this is their land, and their decisions around energy and health and environment is fundamentally their right. And further to that, like, energy is so interconnected with all of these things and that way of living and knowing, that not allowing those different options or barriers to entry or allowable sizes of renewable energy projects is a big stopping point in terms of policy. And a lot of the time, the policy actually is not in line with that of where the technology is going. It's behind. And that's what Laura was getting to. And I was, nodding my head as she was going along, because it's completely true. The policy is not kept up with technology and the changes that are going in terms of communities wanted to take these projects forward. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, there's definitely like this inertia in the system.
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely.
There's inertia in the system, and there's a Canadian psyche that is tied up in that. I was just interviewed. There's like a CBC News article on this where I was talking about the banks and the inertia within the banks. We work with a lot of the big banks in Canada, and they're starting to get it. Like, you're starting to hear from the, very senior bankers saying, we don't have the right risk tolerance for what we need going forward. Like, we're used to things that can make money fast. We're not used to things that have a longer term value. And so how do we rethink about what a good investment, what a good loan is in this new world? Like, we need to rethink about all of this and say the short term gain that has such problem associated with it from an equity perspective, from an environmental perspective, shouldn't be seen as profitable. But we do not have a way to measure that and to integrate that into core decision making for all those that make the business decisions within our. That's why the carbon price thing gets me so excited. The Chief Justice said something that I want to say. He said, we can all agree that climate change is real and humans are the cause, and that we need the peace, order, and good governance of our country is dependent on regulation to internalize those externalities. That's the carbon price, right? So now we have, this is the law of the land from the Supreme Court of Canada now saying we need to actually think about how to make our policies more aligned with the crisis that we see. That's one thing. Second, I want to tell you guys a story about at the Paris Agreement negotiations. It was a side event, and most of the fun stuff actually happens at the side event. And this was someone who said, I feel like I'm an imposter here. I'm just here because I'm bringing distributed renewable energy to underserviced areas in India, and I'm doing it in a way that is the cheapest way, not the way that is the most economic or environmentally friendly. It just makes sense. How can we make that actually the way that we do projects, because it just makes sense? And he's getting exalted by the international community for like bringing solar panels to underserviced areas in India. And he's saying, this is just the cheapest, most economical way of getting them energy. So how do we make sure that that actually happens at scale quicker than we ever thought possible?
If I can build on the points that Laura and Erin have made, I think we want to get at the question of what is called social value of energy. And part of this is in the technological developments that are underway, that part of the solution. But a fair bit of this is also an evolution, let's just call it governance, and the approaches that we begin to articulate that focuses on what is the end use of the energy. The positive aspects around decentralization of energy technologies and energy use and getting to the most difficult parts of the world, which is the underserviced communities, whether they happen to be in remote distant areas here in Canada or around the world, is the nature of decentralized energy technologies. It does break the barrier in terms of massive capital projects with all the issues of challenges that come with it, that a decentralized energy system in essence also becomes a force for democratization, which really gets you to where you want to go, which is, where is that critical energy service that is clean? Not, we can do diesel energy, but it's not really where you want to go. That is clean, that's readily available in remote locations at and near where these communities are. And the technologies are now there and beginning to be developed at a much lower cost and better performance that allows us to be able to do that. So you try to solve two problems all at the same time: the question of equity, energy justice, let's call it, and the climate question through the clean energy developments, which are distributed energy systems based on solar and others.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges though is just in terms of making it affordable, in terms of being able. So let's take Nunavut for example. So if you look at their independent power producing policy there, they're when they're accounting for the cost of diesel, they're not looking at the true cost of diesel. You're looking at the cost of diesel in terms of how much you're paying per kilowatt hour in terms of diesel, as well as the transportation costs, and that's about it. If you're looking at actually the long term and this longevity, 7 generations, let's not even just talk about quarter, let's talk about like a couple generations ahead. You're not accounting for all those externalities. That's not accounted for in that cost. So it's in terms of, I can only speak to our north and speak to here, but it doesn't make them feasible as projects to actually do them. When you're only accounting for what the cost of diesel, you're never going to find it that compares. Like, the price of technology is coming down, but it's still not the cost of diesel. And that's one of the biggest challenges. And that's why I say policy here is, it's without those changes, fundamental changes, you can't make them affordable and feasible.
Mm-hmm.
The three of you speak with such, well, forgive me for saying this, but energy about your own projects. All three of you have pointed to some of the roadblocks that you face, some of which sound as if they're policies, some of which sounds like there's ingrained practices that are involved. I'd like to ask you about two other roadblocks. So one is the quite concerted pushback against energy changes. I'm thinking of organizations like the Government of Alberta's Canadian Energy Centre, based in Alberta, but claiming its own Canadianness. I feel like I'm allowed to speak about them with special criticism, not from my political standpoint, but because I'm a native Albertan. So there is a desire for the story not to change. Mm-hmm. Another perhaps challenge or limit has to do with how publics greet the idea of climate change and of the need to change systems of energy. Laura is right that the public, I think, would agree with the Supreme Court broadly, at quite a high level compared to other countries, that Canada needs to address its climate crisis. One of the things that we have learned in the field of environmental communication is that there's a difficulty in communicating this, but there's actually a kind of a perverse development. The more committed and the more somebody knows about climate change and wants to do some change, the more they get discouraged because of the lack of action. So you have some segment of the population, approximately a third, that is dragging their feet, that may believe in climate change now, but don't see it as a top priority. You have another third that very much believes in it, but now has been discouraged after having this discussion amongst themselves for about more than 2 decades now in an active way. Can you tell me about how your projects and your own work in a more extended way tries to speak to some of these challenges, both talking back to those stakeholders that want to impede any kind of change, but also speaking to publics that have to be animated to be willing to take on the changes that we're proposing?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. As an entrepreneur in the climate tech space, I have this unofficial job that is like counselor for people who are really concerned about climate change. They come and they say, I don't know what I haven't been thinking about this right. What can I do? I feel so guilty. Once they've been, it's really actually, I told my team, like, let's have one day a week where I can talk to people that really want to talk about this stuff, because and they talk about, I would say 50% of the people over a certain age who I talk to, their first line is, my kids really care about this. And what can I do to do something more about this? And they're like, my kid's actually potentially a little depressed about this. So there's a lot of discussions I'm ill-equipped for around, thinking this through, thinking about how do we deal with this. And I think there's something ingrained to your first point, Emra, around not wanting to change, like this fear of the unknown and our wealth being potentially too tied up into this thing that we know is killing us. We know. Like, even these people who are saying we know deep down that the climate is changing. And I think most people, even who are still have a little bit of denier in them, know that this is actually happening. We all know. But there's like this inertia in the system, and it's really hard to deal with. And I think we need to stop thinking about what we can't do and start thinking about what we can do. And I think that will help open up the possibilities of what's next, not what's taken away. I think too much the environmental movement has been about what you have to sacrifice. And that's very challenging to get people on board for. Once we start talking about what the opportunities are and what the future looks like in a more just and equitable and sustainable world, I think there's a lot of potential. And I'd much rather be in that frame of reference than in the acknowledgement of the suffering that's happening that is actually going to happen, but we need to kind of somehow leapfrog over that.
Perhaps I invite my other two panelists to talk about that, but I'd also like to throw in a question from one of the listeners, which I think speaks to some of these same issues, which is a question from Eric. He asks, what are some of the challenges of introducing climate as a monetary cost of a project? If there's a project going forward, how would one include the cost of it? There can be a cleaner building and a building that doesn't pay attention to those principles of trying to do zero impact building. Is it possible to add the environmental cost to the non eco building from the get-go? I guess that's the kind of question that's being posed here.
Absolutely. I think so. Here is a question of how do you, the shadow price of carbon, let's call it, but how do you embed within the actual calculus of full life cycle cost of that particular project the carbon externality? And what transpires is that for a lot of these projects, if you take the full life cycle view of the cost structure, the climate positive solution is always the better one. It is that often there are early barriers in terms of higher capital costs that tend to be the barrier and a way of getting around the question of what the overall life cycle cost effectiveness of that particular solution is. So embedding some sort of a shadow price of carbon or cost of carbon right at the go step makes that project particularly successful, relatively easy to do, and is one way to getting at it. But it does require a little bit of a patience with respect to payback periods and what have you.
Yeah, I'm with Jiten on that one completely, in terms of the life cycle assessment cost of a project and factoring climate in. One of the biggest challenges with that is actually getting people to agree on what that cost actually is. And that's, again, kind of comes back to from the financiers to policymakers to proponents that are leading on these projects, is getting all of those people to agree that this is the cost over the long term, and what that life cycle cost will be is sometimes a challenge. That's what we found on project side. Just going off of your first question there about getting people to move on climate and feeling kind of like they're dragging their feet, and I like everything that Laura pointed out. One of the things that I think is a challenge is that there has been such a huge onus put on the individual, when really when we look at the factors of influence, they're quite minor on an individual level. These need to be coming from, both policymakers, businesses in and of itself, and we've put this onus on the people. So let's take when you go and pump up your car with gas. It says, would you like to, offset your carbon emissions for everything that you're putting into your tank? I worked in the oil and gas sector. It's like, well, that's making me feel guilty about my decision right now. And even though they're doing things at a corporate level, it's kind of that continuous guilt cycle that we're feeling individually. And this is what I feel is draining people out in the climate sphere, is this continuous feeling of guilt for the things that they are doing as individuals. But we need to look at this from a much higher level and say, these people are being put in these situations that they're being forced to make things if they're going to buy organic or if they're going to put food on their table for kids, and that's not fair. So that's one of the things that I've tried to steer away from, is this narrative of individual action. You can still do those things, but it can't come from a place of guilt. It needs to come from a place that you want to do it, and look at it of what kind of changes can I make in my community, whether that be municipal, provincial, territorial, national, international, about those higher level changes. Because in order to have, I think, real incremental action, banning straws across the board, that's something that can be done. But, each person making a daily decision to not having a straw, a lot harder. So.
Yeah, I fully agree.
I wanted to build on what Erin has said and make a point here to link back with the Alberta question you raised earlier. First and foremost, we failed, and we failed miserably because, there's only so much of guilt, shame. The world is going to hell in a handbasket. type of a narrative that it numbs people. Their capacity to worry kind of is overwhelmed, and people say, "I don't know about this anymore." So that's one thing that we need to come to grips with, because people have legitimate concerns. What will happen to my job, my community, if we went down the decarbonization path in a real hurry? And so we need to defang essentially the climate politics. And the way to do that, and there are other countries that have done that relatively successfully, Germany comes to mind, is a much deeper, much more planned, and an approach to look a conversation amongst Canadians, for Canadians, to think through in terms of where our future is going to be, and to begin to address that. Yes, we've got a problem on our hands. Yes, we've got to fix this, and that we can do it in a way that is just not simply accusative and says we don't give a damn about somebody else's community or what will happen to their jobs and so on. And so a full-scale national conversation that begins to move the needle towards saying, we got a problem, how do we solve it? As opposed to, you're the problem and you solve it, and I can sit back and make you feel bad about the choices that you make. So we need to kind of have an honest conversation across the country and defang this. And the Alberta question is actually fairly clear, that the world global markets are going to determine who will and won't want our fossil fuels, and that they may well go out of style way before the lifetime of some of these assets. So we need to be very careful in terms of hanging on to the model that we are dependent on fossil fuels, and that's the only way the Canadian economy can function. That realization has to come to an end now.
And I think I see some of the other questions coming through, because I can see them as well. And maybe what I'm going to say will take some of them as well. But I think the idea of the cost is also kind of tied up into some of the other questions we're seeing coming through, and this idea of applying the climate lens. So what I learned early on in my legal career was talking about adaptation actually opened the doors to the need to mitigate. So talking about dealing with the physical risks of climate change actually made the conversations around reducing emissions easier. I don't think we are doing a disservice to the climate issue if we double down on the discussion around physical risk. Physical risk is serious, and it's more immediate potentially than the transition risks for many of these projects. So when you think about a climate cost, it's not just the long-term costs of climate change we need to think about. It's thinking about this project, does it make sense in the climate we know is coming? And if people start to actually understand, oh crap, this thing I'm going to spend time and money on that's supposed to last me 50 years is not actually going to last me 50 years, because the flooding, the sea level rise, the extreme weather, the lack of ice roads, whatever it be, because of the physical risks of climate change being clear and our modeling being pretty good about that, then they're going to say, there makes no sense for me to be burning fossil fuels on this if I'm going to make this worse over time. So the climate lens and cost association that we want to see going forward is both physical and transition risks, and thinking about longer term modeling applied to the cost of this particular project. So carbon price is only a sliver of that, an important one, but also it's about the long-term modeling about, does this make sense in a future that's impacted by climate?
Yeah,
Maybe I'm sorry. I'd just like to put together you can talk where I just want to make sure that some of the questions come from our listeners. There's two questions that I want to put together, questions by Judith and Harry, which both come down to the challenges of the disjunction between climate being a global event impacting all of us versus the necessity of making decisions at a national level. Harry asks, the first one, that's okay, you can put that one up first. How do we make sure that in other countries there's a movement from dirty energy to cleaner energy, and doing so in a way that that transition is not unjust to those workers? And the question from Harry is a question about, are there ways to make sure that other countries are engaged in the same work that Canadians are hopefully engaged in? Maybe it's the flip, is that other countries might be anxious about the work that Canada is or is not doing. But perhaps you can speak to those two questions. I think they are broadly interrelated.
I can take on the coal question, and the idea that thousands of jobs are going to be lost if you shut down coal power plants is really not valid. Germany is absolutely one of the most interesting examples currently in terms of how they decided to do the coal exit. They have a large sector of the German economy where they mine coal. There's areas, there are jobs tied up with it, and there are environmental consequences of massive coal lignite production in Germany. Through a very extensive 3-year review, they managed to get the entire country on consensus in terms of getting rid of coal, and they have done so. They put it in their legislation. And one of the key things there was that the potential cost involved with shutting down all the coal facilities in the next 15 odd years is that the largest cost would be what would be called labor force adjustment and environmental remediation. So in essence, that can be done. The number of jobs that emerge if you actually move on from coal to cleaner sources of energy is actually quite high. And so the notion, you have to do this in a sensible transition. We're not going to shut everything down tomorrow, but if you plan for it, it's doable, and the costs are not as horrendous as has been argued, and that you can very legitimately look at the question of impacts on communities, both social and economic impacts on communities that will be affected by this shutdown. And you can look at the German coal question the same vein as you would do Alberta's oil sands. So, we have a similar problem on our hands as well, but it can be done.
Yeah, just to add on that, I think, if you look at the biggest investors in Canada in terms of renewable energy and energy transition at large, it is the oil and gas sector, both from a social side, but also in an asset side, an infrastructure side. They are by far the largest investor. And so, they're not dumb organizations. They have their 10, 20, 50-year plans already in place that involves transitions and what those jobs will look like. But in terms of substantive job decreases as a result of that transition, the numbers show that that's actually, as Jiten has mentioned, not necessarily the case in what it looks like even in Canada. So similarly, I know a lot of mining facilities in our northern areas that actually have led the way in terms of microgrid technology and integration of solar, wind, and battery storage. They led that way. So we've gone up to those mines and are using those as examples for other places in the north. So I do see that there's a place for industry actually being a big component and player in this sphere. And I think a lot of them are looking at it already.
Yeah, and maybe I'll tackle the border tariff issue. It can happen. The World Trade Organization has said, don't let international trade rules dictate how we save our species. So international trade rules are not actually the problem. It's just another, of course, this is I'm oversimplifying, but it's just another tactic that's being used to keep that inertia in the system. And in fact, we are actually seeing global investors wanting that sort of clarity and consistency across the world, and being led by things like transparency in capital markets and the stock exchanges asking for that sort of transparency. We just need a level playing field where people can understand. But I really don't think it's a big issue that we're going to lose this emissions will go somewhere else. I think that's convenient narrative that's being used far too much, and it's not actually something that we should be concerned of. We just have to get on with it.
The European Union has made some of the most substantive moves in this area of carbon border adjustments and tariffs along those lines. So that whole agenda is going to move along fairly quickly, and it will get sorted out.
Yeah, we're seeing the Biden administration, for instance, putting a writing on the wall with this. Canada will have to respond. Interesting for me, though, from the theoretical perspective, is this idea of does this lead to globalization 2.0, or does this lead to protectionism and insular policy? So there's a real question mark right now about how we're going to go, and do we believe that globalization is something that we can actually embrace as part of the solution, or will we go back to a more insular management of some of these risks?
There's so many great questions. If I'm not posing them, just be sure that we are looking at them. Maybe on this question of international standards, there's an interesting question posed by Christine. There are all manner of international standards that are shaped, which are technical standards, kind of outside of or in conjunction with governments that become the practice-based standard in various kinds of fields. So Christine asks, to what extent are you aware of international standards developed by the ISO? The one that's pointed to here is the Technical Committee 207, and they point specifically to ISO 14001 environmental management systems. Do you use this in your work?
I'll quickly jump in. We've done some work with the Canadian Standards Association and the Standards Council of Canada. They're going to be posting this in the next week or so, did a guide for standards developers on how to integrate climate change. So absolutely, it's something, and standards take so long to be developed. The management system standards are going to be very helpful in thinking about the systemic issues around climate, but some of the standards related to energy generation, energy transmission are just out of date. How do we get climate-related information and projections into them? Certainly the standard setters are considering that. And I think we now have to go back to first principles when we make decisions around what we do and what we build. The standard is not the only way to go. Like professional negligence, professional decision-making needs to come into it. Sometimes the standards are going to be wrong, and we're going to have to say we have to do things differently. And I think that's going to be a very interesting way forward to see how we deal with that complexity and how we no longer rely on kind of the codes and standards alone without thinking about, are they fit for purpose?
Actually, as a complement to these technical standards, which are the ISO standards, what is even more interesting is they get coupled into the broader developments around corporate governance and the whole question of at the corporate governance level that Laura mentioned earlier, the task force on understanding the liability and risks within corporate governance that Mark Carney led at the Financial Stability Board is now becoming pretty standard in investment circles, is to really for corporate managers to understand what is the risk that you are subjecting your investment decisions to, and if you are subject to climate type of risk, do you understand it? And that whole process is beginning to see divestment and movement of investment capital away from fossil fuels, again, guided by technical standards that are underneath that kind of broad level perspective on where the money goes in terms of investments for cleaner technologies.
So we're nearing the end of our available time. I invite anybody who made questions that they weren't answered, please join us after this event. The chat rooms, 30 seconds, final words for each of you. Erin, do you mind starting?
Okay, I'll use my 30 seconds to say, I think that I don't know how many students are on the line, but before anyone enters the workforce, they really need an education in terms of Canada's true history with Indigenous people. And, I have the utmost respect and admiration for Ferrodin, and I'm a loyal alumnus of Waterloo. And perhaps what I'm going to say is a bit controversial, but I do think there is a responsibility and an onus as the largest co-op provider in the world, being Waterloo, to ensure Canadian students and international students have fundamental information about Canada's history before we enter the workforce. And, I think it's something as simple as, PD courses, but I think if we're talking about humans plus technologies, humans plus climate, that technology needs to go on somebody's land in Canada. We work on somebody's land. And so I will leave it with that just to say that's my ask.
Excellent point. Laura, you have 30 seconds as well. I'm sorry it's so short.
Yeah, I think that this has been a really robust conversation, and I think there's a lot to do. I think by aligning better information with our decision making, that's one of the most important things that we can do. So if any of the folks on the line are business leaders, are in a board position, you now have a requirement to think about climate change and the decisions that you're making. It is now table stakes, just like what you would think about any other cost input, long-term strategic issue. Climate change has to become core to everyone's consideration of the decisions that they're making. It's no longer the sustainability department's problem. It is the core problem of everyone thinking about how their own role interacts with this crisis. We need to now all own this, embrace it, not be scared about it, but actually seek out the information we need to make better decisions that are aligned with a sustainable future.
Thank you very much. And yeah.
If I can summarize, the climate is not an environmental problem, it's an energy technology transition problem. And if I can only point out that the lack of energy access around the world actually translates to 4 million plus annual mortality that is larger than malaria, AIDS, and TB combined, primarily because of the noxious pollution that arises from bad use of fossil fuels in homes and huts in all over Africa. So that lack of access has an enormous health impact, as well as, of course, lack of energy that drives people into extreme poverty.
Thanks very much for your comments and your responses to the questions posed to you today. I'm going to turn things back over to Joanne, and we will see you in a few minutes.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much for a very informative and exciting panel. And now I would like to introduce our president, Feridun Hamdulapur, who I know will be very excited about all of the topics that were covered right now. Feridun, over to you.
Again, good afternoon, everybody. First, let me express my gratitude to our panelists, Imre, great moderating, and Aaron, Laura, and Jatin. Before I try to wrap this up and add my own a few thoughts into it, Aaron, let me start with the last comment, incredibly important and strong comment you made, and that is, yes, as much as I'm proud of myself or my colleagues acknowledging our land here every time we host an event or anything like that, we have to do far more beyond that. And we shouldn't just say that, well, we are acknowledging the land, we fulfilled our responsibilities. The university is taking a very serious ownership of what you suggested. And we are, I admit that we were negligent a few years ago. We kind of relied on one of our colleges here that they were doing what we should have been doing years ago, but we are really making advances. And absolutely, awareness, education, understanding our incredibly important roots, history, heritage of this country will be incredibly important, regardless of what discipline our students are studying. With that, and again, Laura, you touched on it. Today is a very important day, especially from the Supreme Court decision perspective. I dare to call it a historic decision. Yet, despite that important decision, we still, the same last weekend, one of the major political parties, they made some contrary remarks related to climate change. Regardless of that, we know that right from first day of the Industrial Revolution, the day one that humans started using the steam engine, and how we started from that day really hurting our climate environment. To me, the climate change started on that day, and it's been developing since then. We are at a point where no more negligence. We cannot ignore the impact, the scientific realities of climate change, what carbon dioxide does, what kind of role it plays. But it needs to be pushed beyond that. We can do a lot of things in our own country, but climate change is not a local issue, it's a global issue, and it has no borders. So where do we start understanding this? So with that, I think, let me again thank our panelists and our participants, our alumni, being here today talking about this incredibly important topic. And one will say that, well, we've been talking about this for a while. Yes, that's true, but I don't think that we're talking about it enough. There is a lot more areas to cover, as we witnessed today. Incredibly rich conversation, incredibly rich, presentations. Yet, I feel like we barely scratched the surface. There are so many other things that we need to find out and public need to know. Awareness, and with that awareness, understanding and actionizing those understandings will be incredibly important. Our climate is changing. The temperature rise 2 degrees. We are heading towards that despite all of our efforts. The global population is still increasing. Therefore, the demand for energy usage will continue. All of these bring us to a point where we need to think beyond technological solutions. We need to have a much better understanding of global policy level solutions. As you can see, this is an area that Jatina and I spend a lot of time discussing, trying to find solutions. But I will stop there because I just realized that I'm about to exceed the time allocated to me, and Joanne will be very upset with me if I did that. So let me stop here. Thank you so much, all of our participants today. This is a conversation that needs to continue with actions, and I think we are determined to do that. Thank you so much. I'll turn it back to you, Joanne.
Thank you very much, Faridun. I appreciate that. Thank you, Imre, Aaron, Laura, and Jatine. It was an incredible conversation. We're all very grateful. And one thing in particular that I appreciated were your challenges and your calls to action. You presented an incredibly sound, rational, logical point of view that I think is very Waterloo in nature. To our audience, the extended question and answer sessions will continue in the sessions rooms that you'll see on the left-hand side of your screen. And if you'll click on those to see which panelists are in which sessions, then you can join them. And I've heard from other sessions that these question and answer sessions are extremely helpful, and the people in co-op will still be on the panels as well. Waterloo, our university, contributes to society through talent and the ambition of the members in our community. We act and we drive results. And this today was a wonderful example of how our alumni and our faculty are addressing pressing societal issues and making a true impact in the world in places that really matter. So to you, the audience, I thank you very much for today's discussion. The next event in this series will focus on humans and emerging technology on May 19th. And so please look for your invitation in April and join us again. And thank you very much. We hope to see you again soon.